A cross-in-square or cross-dome plan was the dominant architectural form of Middle and late-period Byzantine churches, featuring a square center with an internal structure shaped like a cross topped by a dome. The first cross-in-square churches were probably built in the late 8th century, and the form has remained in use throughout the Orthodox world until the present day. In the West, Donato Bramante's first design for St. Peter's Basilica was a centrally planned cross-in-square under a dome and 4 subsidiary domes. In German, such a church is a Kreuzkuppelkirche, or cross-dome church. In French, it is an aile sequoia inscrite church with an inscribed cross. Architecture. Architectural form. A cross-in-square church is centered around a quadratic naros which is divided by 4 columns or piers into 9 bays. The inner 5 divisions form the shape of a quincunx. The central bay is usually larger than the other 8, and is crowned by a dome which rests on the columns. The 4 rectangular bays that directly adjoin this central bay are usually covered by barrel vaults. These are the arms of the cross, which is inscribed within the square of the naros. The 4 remaining bays in the corner are usually groin vaulted. The spatial hierarchy of the 3 types of bay, from the largest central bay to the smallest corner bays, is mirrored in the elevation of the building. The domed central bay is taller than the cross arms, which are in turn taller than the corner bays. To the west of the naros stands the narthex, or entrance hall, usually formed by the addition of 3 bays to the westernmost bays of the naros. To the east stands the bema, or sanctuary, often separated from the naros by templon or, in later churches, by an iconostasis. The sanctuary is usually formed by 3 additional bays adjoining the easternmost bays of the naros, each of which terminates in an apse crowned by a conch. The central apse is larger than those to the north and south. The term bema is sometimes reserved for the central area, while the northern section is known as the prothesis and the southern as the diaconicone. Although evidence for Byzantine domestic architecture is scant, it appears that the core unit of the cross-in-square church was also employed for the construction of halls within residential structures. Liturgical use. The architectural articulation of the distinct spaces of a cross-in-square church corresponds to their distinct functions in the celebration of the liturgy. The narthex serves as an entrance hall, but also for special liturgical functions, such as baptism, and as an honored site of burial. The naros is the space where the congregation stands during the service. The sanctuary is reserved for the priests. The altar stands in the central bay, or bema, which is sometimes provided with a synthronon, or bench where the clergy may sit. The prothesis is used for the preparation of the Eucharist, and the diaconicone houses liturgical vestments and texts used in the celebration of the liturgy. Common variations. The architectural form and liturgical function described above correspond to the classic type of the cross-in-square church, which is exhibited by a number of significant monuments. However, this classic type represents only one of a number of possible variations on the cross-in-square form. Particularly in later Byzantine architecture, the core of the cross-in-square plan could be augmented through the addition of peripheral structures. An example is provided by the Chora Church in Constantinople. The original 11th century cross-in-square was expanded in the 14th century through the addition of a second narthex to the west and by a side chapel, to the south, used for burials. The ultimate plans of many other Byzantine churches resulted from a similar diachronic succession of additions about a central cross-in-square core. For example, Kalendahana Kami in Constantinople, Kanlikalis in Cappadocia, and the Martirana in Palermo. One particularly common subsidiary structure, witnessed, for example, at Kalendahana, the Chora Church, and the Martirana, was a bell tower. On the other hand, a radically abbreviated, compact form of the cross-in-square existed, built without narthex and with the 3 apses adjoining directly onto the easternmost bays of the naros. This plan was particularly common in the provinces, for example in southern Italy, in Sicily, and in Cappadocia. In this type of church, the templon barrier was often erected along the axis of the two eastern columns, thus enclosing the three easternmost bays within the sanctuary. A particularly important variation on the cross-in square is the so-called Athonite, or monastic, plan. This plan, often held to be typical of monastic churches, seems to have developed on Mount Athos in the 11th century. The lateral apses provided a space for the performance of antiphonal liturgical music by two monastic choirs. An important example of this type outside of Athos is the 14th century church known as Prophetess Elias in Thessaloniki. Decoration. The interior decoration of the cross-in square church, usually executed in mosaic but also sometimes in fresco, evolved in close relationship to its architecture, and a classical system of decoration may be discerned, represented in particular by the great monastic churches of the 11th century. This system was defined in a classic study published in the 1940s by Otto Demas, which is summarized in the following account. The mosaic decoration of a cross-in square church may be divided into three zones defined by the architectural articulation of the interior: an upper zone, which embraces the cupolas, high vaults, and the conch of the apse; a middle zone, including the squinches, pendentives, and upper parts of the vaults; and the lowest zone, composed of the lower or secondary vaults and the lower parts of the walls. The tripartite division has cosmographic significance. The uppermost zone corresponds to heaven, the middle zone to paradise or the Holy Land, and the lower zone to the terrestrial world. In the uppermost zone, only the holiest figures of Christianity are represented, or scenes that are directly related to heaven. For example, the mosaics of the central dome almost invariably represent one of three scenes: the Ascension, Pentecost, or Christ Pantocrator. The middle zone is dominated by narrative scenes representing the great Christological feasts. The lowermost zone is occupied by the choir of saints, mostly full-length standing figures, who in Demas's words, share the space of the congregation. In the classic system, the mosaics were composed so as to be viewed from the west of the church, that is to say, they were oriented towards the lay beholder. In accordance with this line of vision, the curved spaces of the vaults were employed to create an illusion of space when viewed from the intended angle. The decoration of the cross-in square church was therefore integrally related to its architecture. The Byzantine church itself is the picture space of the icons. It is the ideal iconostasis. It is itself, as a whole, an icon giving reality to the conception of the divine world order, origins and development. The cross-in square church may be said to constitute a unique artistic development of the Middle Byzantine period. Early Byzantine churches were predominantly basilical or centrally planned. The question of the origins of the cross-in square form has therefore engaged art historians since the latter half of the 19th century. Although no single account has ever received the unanimous assent of the scholarly community, the most influential strands in the earlier research attempt to derive the cross-in square church either from the early Christian basilica or from the cruciform churches of late antiquity. According to the basilical theory, the crucial intermediary buildings were the so-called cross-domed churches of the 7th and 8th centuries, while according to the latter theory the corners of cruciform churches were simply filled in. As the discipline of art history has moved away from an evolutionary approach, the question of the parentage of the cross-in square church has receded somewhat, and attention has turned to the dating of the first fully developed examples of the type. Significant in this regard are the church today known as Fati, Kami in Trili, Bithynia and the so-called Church H inside. It has been suggested that the type was developed in a monastic context in Bithynia during the late 8th and early 9th centuries. For example, the church built at the Sarkudian monastery in the 780s by Theodore the Studitor and his uncle Platon, although known only from literary accounts, appears to have been a cross in square. The influence of the Ecclesia in the Great Palace of Constantinople, built around 880, has often been described as crucial to the dominance of the cross-in-square plan in the medieval period. However, the building has not survived. Its actual form is much disputed, and it is by no means certain that it was a genuine cross-in-square. Whatever the reasons, the cross-in-square had come to dominate church building by the later 9th century. Perhaps in part because its relatively small scale suited the intrinsically private nature of Byzantine piety. The achievements of later Byzantine architecture have been described as the elaboration of a type of church that was, in its own way, perfect. The near-universal acceptance of the cross-in-square plan in the Byzantine world does not, however, imply the stagnation of artistic creativity, as the numerous variations on the type demonstrate. These variations seem to represent, not so much a linear evolution of forms, as a series of sensitive responses to various local factors. Already during the Middle Ages, the cross-in-square plan had spread far beyond the political borders of the Byzantine Empire. The type was adopted and developed in Kiev, in Rus, and in the various independent kingdoms of the northern Balkans. The cross-in-square church also outlived the political collapse of the Byzantine Empire, continuing to serve as a model for church construction both in Russia and in the Ottoman Balkans and Asia Minor. In the Balkans, the plan remained common until c. 1700, especially the Athonite variation, a sign of the importance of monastic patronage in this period. The maintenance of this architectural tradition, and its resistance to Turkish and Western influences, has been seen as a means of preserving a unique identity for the Orthodox Church. Beginning in the 18th century, a greater variety of architectural forms were employed for church building in the Ottoman Empire, including revivals of early Christian types. Although the Neo-Byzantine architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries tended to draw on an eclectic set of historical references, the cross-in-square plan did play a role in the formation of national styles in the new, post-Ottoman states. Literature. Ch. Boris, the Byzantine tradition in the church architecture of the Balkans in the 16th and 17th centuries. Ian J.J. Yannias, ed. The Byzantine tradition after the fall of Constantinople, 107-49. ISBN 0-8139-1329-2. S. Kirchich, The Architecture, in E. Kitzinger, The Mosaics of St. Mary's of the Admiral in Palermo. ISBN 0-88402-179-3. Kirchich, Slobodan. The Role of Late Byzantine Thessalonica in Church Architecture in the Balkans. Dumbarton Oaks Papiers 57. 65-84. DOI 10.2307 1291876. JSTOR 1291876. O. Demas, Byzantine Mosaic Decoration. Aspects of Monumental Art in Byzantium. Longy, Dorothea. Verein zur Entstehung der Byzantinischen Kreuzkuppelkirche. Architectura 16. 93-113. Ca. Mango, Byzantine Architecture. ISBN 0-8109-1004-7. Mantopola Panagia Topola, Thalia S. The Monastery of Agios Menos in Thessaloniki. Dumbarton Oaks Papiers 50. 239-62. DOI 10.2307 1291746. JSTOR 1291746. Matthews, Thomas, Matthews, Unni, Christine Daskalakis, Matthews, Daskalakis. Islamic-style mansions in Byzantine Cappadocia and the development of the inverted T-plan. The Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, 56. 294 to 315. DOI 10.2307 991,243. JSTOR 991,243. Milonus, Paul. Le plan initial du Catholicon de la Grande Lavra au Mont Athos et la Geneste type du Catholicon Athenite. Cahiers Archaeologiques 32. 89 to 112. Ousterhout, Robert. An Apologia for Byzantine Architecture. Gesta 35. 21 to 33. DOI 10.2307 767,224. JSTOR 767,224. R. Ousterhout, The Architecture of the Karia Kami in Istanbul. ISBN 0-88402-1653. R. Ousterhout, A Byzantine Settlement in Cappadocia. ISBN 0-88402-310-9. R. Ousterhout, Master Builders of Byzantium. ISBN 0-691-00535-4. R. Ousterhout, Reconstructing 9th Century Constantinople, in L. Brubaker, ed. Byzantium in the 9th Century. Dead or Alive, 115 to 30. ISBN 0-86078-686-2. Pantelich, Bratislav, Nationalism and Architecture. The Creation of a National Style in Serbian Architecture and its Political Implications. The Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, 56. 16 to 41. DOI 10.2307 991,214. JSTOR 991,214. Papazotos, Thanasis. The Identification of the Church of Prophetess Elias, in Thessaloniki. Dumbarton Oaks Papiers 45, 121 to 27. DOI 10.2307 1,291,696. JSTOR 1,291,696. T. Pratch, Theodora Studites. Zwischen Dogma and Pragma. ISBN 3-631-33877-5. CL. Stryker, Kalender Hanna in Istanbul. ISBN 3-8053-2026-4.